Now it's my privilege to introduce one of the most passionate, hardworking, and effective champions of human rights in the United States Senate, Senator Ben Cardin. After 10 terms in the House of Representatives representing Maryland's 3rd Congressional District, he was elected to the Senate in 2006. As the ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Cardin has been a strong and vocal proponent of putting human rights at the heart of U.S. foreign policy. For more than 2 decades, Senator Cardin served on the U.S. Helsinki Commission, twice as chairman, and this year he was named as the Special Representative on Anti-Semitism, Racism, and Intolerance for the 57-nation Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE's Parliamentary Assembly, a hugely important post in light of what's happening today on the continent. Whether the focus is U.S. relations with South Sudan or Egypt or oppressive governments in Central Asia, Senator Cardin has led efforts to shape U.S. foreign policy that sides with those fighting for freedom on the front lines and not with their oppressors. He is the driving force behind the Global Magnitsky Act, which you heard about earlier today, a potential game changer in U.S. foreign policy. The bill would direct the president to place a variety of serious sanctions on foreign nationals proven to have a direct role in gross human rights abuses. And because the most powerful form of leadership is leadership by example, Senator Cardin has also focused on respect for human rights here at home, leading efforts to fight discrimination in law enforcement and strengthen voting rights. Senator Cardin knows that protecting the inherent dignity of all people is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, because respect for human rights creates a better world for all of us. As a resident of Maryland, I'm proud to call him my senator. Please join me in welcoming Senator Ben Cardin.
Lisa, that was a great introduction. I'm going to take you around with me. I don't get treated that well in the Senate, so it's really good to be here. It's good to be with friends. I really was looking forward to this opportunity. Human Rights First and the Human Rights Summit, to me, is just a wonderful gathering to make an assessment of where we are and to jointly plan strategies as to how we can advance human rights. Your subject or topic, American ideals, universal values, is something that really strikes home, I think, to all of us. Just to give you by way of example, yesterday in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we held a hearing on the Millennium Challenge Corporation and talked about how the United States program is helping to develop democratic institutions with entrepreneurs and respect for the individual and the impact we're making. These are truly American ideals being transformed into universal values. So your topic of your discussion and the subtopics are very, very relevant. We just completed a hearing on the United Nations peacekeeping in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Ambassador Power was before us, and we had good discussions on the human rights agenda within the United Nations. So it's a very timely subject, and I thank you. Obviously, I think the great contribution that America has made is the fact that we do have the ability to articulate ideals and to pursue those ideals and get a consensus on universal values. And we need to continue that contribution. And one of the ways that we need to understand that is through our diplomacy and our development assistance. So I congratulate Secretary Clinton, who was the first to understand that our national security budget is more than our Department of Defense, but also includes the Department of State in development assistance and in diplomacy. To me, that's a very, very important part of our strategies. Let me go back a while and thank an unlikely ally, the Soviet Union. In 1975, when it suggested that we form the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, it was the Soviet Union that was the driving force behind that effort. There was a reluctancy in the United States because we said, why are we engaging the Soviet Union, a country that does not have democratic institutions? And we were able to get, in the Helsinki process, now the OSCE, the understanding that if you're going to have security, it's more than defense, but also includes economic opportunity and includes human rights. And we developed, through that process, globally recognized human rights standards. It dealt with the right of the press to be able to fairly report, individuals' right to express their views in opposition to a government, free and fair elections, the opportunity to practice your religion. These were incorporated into a consensus organization that said that we all agreed to adhere to these global standards. Yes, they were U.S. ideals, but they became global values. And the Helsinki process did more than that. It said that we, any member state, has the right to challenge any other member state's conduct as to whether they are living up to these values. Why? Because we're all citizens, all members of the global community, and we all are affected when there's instability in any country. And if a country doesn't respect its human rights, doesn't allow for economic empowerment, it's not going to be a stable country, as we've seen. And we all pay a heavy price for it. So it's in our interest to raise those issues. And as Elisa said, I've raised those issues in the United States. We're not in full compliance with the Helsinki Accords. We have denied the people of the District of Columbia full voting rights in the United States for United States Congress. That's wrong. You can't justify that. And we should change. Our conduct at Gitmo Bay with torture was wrong. And our criminal justice system is badly out of step with universal values. And we need to look at that as to how we can adjust and become the beacon for hope around the world by first taking care of business at home. In the Helsinki process, we looked at transparency. Transparency is a hugely important subject. I got involved with Senator Lugar on the extractive industries, recognizing that for many poor countries, the resources became a resource curse. And with transparency, we hope to be able to get that wealth to the people of that country rather than financing corruption. And we have now put a real spotlight on fighting corruption. Like the values of the Helsinki process, no country is pure. In corruption, no country is pure. But we do recognize that we can do better. This past weekend, I was in Paris and had a chance to participate firsthand in the COP21 climate summit. As Pope Francis said, this is a moral challenge of our time. It is a human rights issue. Living in a planet where you have a future is a concern to everyone. And I am very proud of the U.S. leadership. 150 leaders appeared at the same day in Paris. Never before, unprecedented, that we had so many world leaders recognizing the importance. This was U.S. leadership. It was clearly our ideals of a safe planet. U.S. got China to move, and now 184 countries are prepared to move on the climate agenda. That's the type of leadership we need in our country. Obviously, Paris is also important to be there because of the recent terrorist attacks in Paris and Mali and in California. We have seen the ravages of terrorism. So it's in our interest to come together and figure out strategies. I must tell you, I was extremely disappointed when we look at the reaction in our own country to the events of Paris. Continuing until the remarks of a presidential candidate this week that we should close our borders to Iraqi and Syrian refugees. That's outrageous and brings out the worst of our country. That presidential candidate tried to justify it by saying, look, during World War II, we knew it was important to inter Japanese Americans. One of the dark moments in the history of America. Two of my colleagues were involved, their families, Congressman Matsui and Congressman Mineta. It was a dark moment. And I know that the popular sentiment might be to close our borders. But I remind you that in 1938, when the question was asked to Americans as to whether Jewish children from Europe should be able to come to the United States to be saved from the concentration camps, 60% also said no. I mention that because Human rights are our ideals, no question about it. They are our values. But at times, we have to do a much more effective job in educating the American people. And that's our responsibility as leaders. We must do a better job in how we broadcast these issues. You understand that the 2,000 Syrian relocations in the United States are victims of terrorists and of conflict and have nothing to do with terrorist activities here in the United States. You understand that we have a process where a refugee resettled in the United States must establish, they have the burden of proof that they were victims. And then they have to go through so much vetting to make sure that they have no criminal connections or terrorist connections. The process takes 18 to 24 months. So this is a misdirected attack and does not represent U.S. values. We have to do a better job. To keep America safe, let's look at ways that we can do the right thing for the people of this country. So let me make some suggestions for improving world security through human rights moving forward. How can we do a better job? Human rights first. You understand that. It is our security. But how can we improve the way we do our work? Well, first, I think we need a more expansive view of what human rights entails. We made a major victory on the Sustainable Development Goal number 16 at the United Nations, in which the rule of law was put forward as one of the major goals of the global community, to ensure access to justice for all while working to substantially reduce corruption and bribery and develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions. This is particularly appropriate today on International Anti-Corruption Day. I hope every day is Anti-Corruption Day. We have to do a more effective job. Elisa mentioned the Magnitsky Act, in which we passed the law related to Russia that makes it clear that if you deny people in your own country their human rights, in this case Sergei Magnitsky's life because he reported corruption, that is not an internal issue to your own country, but there is global interest in that because it's fundamental to human rights. And we are working to make that law global. I'm working with Senator McCain, and we are optimistic. We're down pretty close to getting it through the United States Senate. I was in Ukraine not too long ago, and the reason for the problems in Ukraine didn't have much to do with Russia or Europe and the conflict between Russia and Europe. It had to do with a corrupt system that the people of Ukraine were tired. The Maidan was about having a government that would respect their rights, that you didn't have to pay a bribe to get health care for your children or to go to school or to get a license. That's what they were frustrated about. And today in Ukraine, their success is very much dependent upon securing their borders, and we're doing what we can in regards to Russia, but it's also about human rights. It's also about anti-corruption. It's also about empowering the people. That's a lesson that I think we have learned. Corruption fuels a booming business in the sale and abuse of human beings. To me, there is no greater sin than modern-day slavery in the trafficking of human beings. And it, as you know, is deadly. The Rohingya grave sites that were recently discovered, victims of trafficking. So that's why, quite frankly, we get somewhat exercised when the trafficking in person report, the TIP report, appears to be politically manipulated in order to accomplish other foreign policy objectives. And I spoke out against that. Senator Corker spoke out against it. People in this room spoke out against it. And because we weren't silent, we have made a difference. I expect that the customs report, the conference report that's coming out will also speak to this issue. We cannot compromise our commitment to have objective reviews of every country in the universe and the commitments they are making to stop modern-day slavery. There's many reasons for that, and we will continue to do it. Let me just mention one other issue about our priorities and expanded rights and human rights, and that's gender equity issues. I've said this before, and I'll stand by it. The way a country treats its women is an indicator of how stable and how successful that country will be. The truth is that women generally make better investments than men. You invest in children and education. Men invest in war toys. And we need to make sure that women are empowered globally. And that needs to be part of our effort. I'm glad that got a round of applause. Thank you. I even see men applauding. That's good. Let me mention a second issue on our concern to broaden our agenda on human rights. And that is that we need our commitment to the principles of democracy. Democracy is one of the great building blocks for human rights and for accountability and for growth. We see that today in Burundi, and there will be a hearing on that later today in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where the president just ignored the popular sentiment and ran for a third term, which immediately compromised the human rights in their country, causing 300,000 refugees. We see that today in Russia, where they are replacing the rule of law with the rule by law, suppressing legitimate civil society activism. We need to be active in denouncing what's happening in Russia today. We got to counter what they do through the way that they've handled the propaganda, particularly through the social media. They're more sophisticated than we are. Of course, they're ruthless, and we are not. And they lie, and we try not to. But we have to be able to counter what they are doing. And we have to defend independent journalists. It's dangerous to be a journalist in Russia. It's dangerous to be a journalist in many parts of the world. We have to defend them. And it's, to me, extremely important to have democratic values. We're fighting a war today against ISIL in the Middle East. We're going to look at the future of Iraq or look at the future of Syria. If they can't get democratic institutions that represent all the people, the vacuum will be taken up by extremists, and we'll never have the stability we need. Human rights leads to democracy and rights for all people and eliminates the vacuum that's created by extremists. And then third, let me mention that we have to engage our youth. We have to recognize that when we don't, radicalization occurs when there's a void, and we've seen that happen too often. Lisa mentioned that I'm the special representative of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly on anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance. In that regard, I have traveled through Europe to talk about the causes of why young people particularly are radicalized as to people who are different, whether they're Jews or Muslims or refugees. Why are they being so difficult to integrate into a community? And its truth is, it starts with the young people. They learn from their homes and they don't know anything different, so they become radicalized. And what we're working on is investing resources in our educational system, in our schools, with teachers who are qualified to understand the challenges of the refugee community and of the ethnic communities. So investing more in our schools. In my own town of Baltimore, you may have heard we had a little problem not too long ago. I've been in Baltimore quite a bit. I live in Baltimore. And I've been through the neighborhoods. And I can tell you that if we don't reform our criminal justice system in the United States, we're going to radicalize many, many more young people. If their life is all about a revolving door in our prison system rather than real opportunity in the community, we're going to pay a heavy price. Let's pay attention to our youth. I was this year in Honduras and El Salvador. If you want to go to an extreme case with their gang activities, to me it was shocking. I met young people there. Oh, wonderful, wonderful children who just want a future. These kids are under USAID programs, and I can see their future. And then I recognize that if they live in a certain neighborhood, when they turn a certain age, they're going to be forced to join a gang. And when they join that gang, they're going to have to kill somebody, because that's how you get into the gang. I had a chance to interview a gang member who was under the custody of the FBI trying to cut a deal. And he explained to me how the gangs operate. And he really got my attention when he told me that he comes frequently to the United States, not legally, just comes in through the border, to set up sister gangs. I said, where did you do that? He said, Maryland. He got my attention. We got to pay attention to our youth and do a much better job in that regard. So a few final thoughts. We've got to better align our budgets for diplomacy, military, and development. I've talked about that, but that's going to be critically important. If we're going to be able to stop ISIL, we have to be able to deal with the voids that exist today in which good people go astray and ultimately become radicalized and support these extremist groups. We need to look at legislation. We're going to be following a genocide and atrocity prevention bill so that we have the resources to deal with this on a global state. And we need accountability. I mentioned this with Ambassador Power today, and let me mention it here. All of us want a solution for Syria. All of us recognize that Syria we have to do through diplomacy. There won't be a military solution. We all understand that. But at the end of the day, if Assad is not held accountable for his war crimes on barrel bombing his own people, we will see another Assad again. We've got to hold those who commit these international human rights violations accountable for their actions. We can't take a pass on that. So the challenges that we face are certainly global, but they're not insurmountable. Our ideals are universal values, and there's broad global support for these values. We will win this debate, and we will win by our actions. And I must tell you, I am optimistic when I look around the room and see so many of you who are in this fight because you recognize this is what we're about, and this is the contribution we can make. And when we succeed, there's going to be a safer world for our children and grandchildren. Thank you very much for what you would do every day, and I'm proud to be on your team. I have 5 minutes.
Okay, we're going to take a couple of questions. Thank you so much. We covered a lot of ground. You covered a lot of ground there, as you do every day in the Senate, and we're so grateful that you're spending some time with us, Senator. I have a question, and I'll ask it quickly, so give the audience a chance to think. My question is, in your post at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly on combating anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance, that's an issue that Human Rights First has focused a lot of attention on broader issues of xenophobia, but also in particular on anti-Semitism and the rise of anti-Semitism. The new hate crime statistics just came out for the U.S., and we still have a problem here. And anti-Semitism, there's more violent anti-Semitic acts than against any other minority in the United States. But I feel like we have a lot as a country, having dealt with, through the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Act, we've done a lot to get a handle on that, and we have strategies for dealing with it. We're doing a big report on France that we're going to release, and that's really ground zero for the future of Jews in Europe, I think. And there you've got, anti-Muslim and marginalization of Muslim immigrant communities, and the rise of the far right. You just saw with the elections in France this week, or last week. What do you think, as Americans and the U.S. government, that we could be doing to help our friends in Europe deal with this problem?
Thank you for that question.
They're going to turn it on.
Oh, they'll turn it on?
Is it on?
I don't think so.
Here, use this one.
Okay. Thank you for that question. There are 4 priorities that I've set for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly Special Rep. One of them is the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. It is true, there is in the rise here in the United States. There's no question about it. But in visiting Europe, it's an extremely dangerous situation for the Jewish population. France is ground zero. It's the largest Jewish population in Europe, and it's also the largest Muslim population in Europe. And the challenge has been that France will tell you, the people of France will say, well, this isn't really our problem. This is a Middle East problem that sort of came to our shores. Mind you, that much of the Jewish population has been there for a long time. as well as the Muslim population has been there. There's been a large Muslim population in France for a long time. So France needs to take ownership of this, and they haven't yet. They have a strategy, but it's not an all-in strategy. And we're pushing them very hard, particularly on the education front, and to better organize the Muslim community so that there can be more priorities set locally. I don't want to leave that, so yes, reinforce that. The United States needs to reinforce the urgency of Europe to deal with anti-Semitism. It's not government-inspired, it's individual, not like World War II. However, you look at Hungary, you look at Greece, you look at other countries where you see anti-Semitism in the official government actions. So there is a concern of the rise in governments as well. I don't want to leave without the other three priorities, as they're very important. One is discriminatory policing, which is very much an issue here in the United States that we have to deal with. It's also a problem in Europe, by the way. But we need to deal with the discriminatory policing. The confidence of neighborhoods, good community activists about why they don't want to help the police because they think they're hurting their own people. And it's a real dilemma because of the discriminatory nature of our criminal justice system. It's a very high priority. The Muslim population in Europe is also very much at risk. And that's another one of our priorities. And then fourthly, we're taking on the refugees. Discrimination against refugees and the danger of violence against refugees here in the United States as well as globally in Europe is a matter of major concern. So I didn't want you to think it's just anti-Semitism, although anti-Semitism in Europe is clearly a matter of urgency.
Great. We have time for a question? Yes, right here. Do you have a mic that works out there? Great.
Senator Cardin, thank you for your leadership in the Senate. I'm from Georgia, but your leadership as a senator from Maryland has meant a lot to me, so thank you. I wanted to ask if you could expound on your comments on the criminal justice system and specifically the prison system as possibly the most important human rights challenge that we're facing here in the U.S., because I agree with you.
Well, there are several parts of our criminal justice system that is out of step for the international community. The number of people we incarcerate is well higher than other countries of the world, many for nonviolent crimes. When you look at the demographics of what's in our prison system and you look at those who are, we have demographics on crime and demographics of what's in our what's in the prison system, and minority neighborhoods are clearly discriminated against. If you look at sentencing guidelines, they're very discriminatory against minority communities. If you look at the way that police set up their police activities, you find discrimination against minority communities. So there's a lack of confidence. As I said before, you need neighborhoods working with the police. After our neighborhoods want to be safe, I can tell you in minority communities, they are reluctant to work with the police because they think they're really being unloyal to their own population. So there's a disconnect here, too many people in prison. Secondly, if you need certain health services, you can't get it in the community. A lot of people are ending up in our prison systems because of the failure to provide adequate access to health. Again, it discriminates against vulnerable people, generally minorities, but it discriminates against vulnerable people. So we have a lot of people in prison strictly because of mental illness, which is an area that has to change. And then we don't deal with people coming out of prison. The reentry programs in America are willfully just inadequate. So we have to do a much stronger job in dealing with reentry. Reentry works, and the Obama administration has put forward some really good proposals on reentry, including educational programs within our penal system, jobs, eliminating the check the box, those type of issues. And so we're making progress. I'll mention one last point, and that is capital punishment, which is iconic for America being with the worst countries in the world. We need to really reevaluate the way that we have allowed the capital punishment laws to be so out of step with the international community.
Thank you. Yeah, this doesn't work. We have time for one more question. Speak now. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Ilham Mania. I'm a political scientist and human rights advocate of Yemeni and Swiss origins. I appreciate your speech. You have inspired me. But if we are talking about Syria, I agree with you that diplomacy is very important, but the situation right now, specifically with Daesh and ISIS presence there, perhaps would need more also, more kind of like deliberation on different kind of strategies to tackle the issue. And I'm not calling here for American intervention. In fact, I'm calling for a United Nations kind of mandate and intervention, because the situation right now there will not be solved by just basically bombarding or going through diplomacy.
Well, I agree with you completely, but there are multiple issues in Syria. The two major issues: you have a civil war going on, and you have ISIL controlling a lot of territory, who are terrorists, who kill innocent people, who have their own interpretation of a mission, and it includes taking territory and killing people who disagree with them. So we got to attack both. The problem is we're divided in the civil war. You got Russia on the side of Assad, and you got the rest of the world, and with Iran, and you have the rest of the world basically on the side of getting rid of Assad. And Russia's physical presence there is more to protect Assad than to go after ISIL. You also have a coalition of opposition that runs the gamut, some of which we like, some of which we don't like. And you have moderate Gulf countries that are not necessarily inconsistent strategies with how we can deal with the civil war. So number one, we got to end the civil war, because that's causing the largest humanitarian crisis is being caused by the civil war itself. And to end that, it's going to be diplomacy. And it's going to take Russia and the United States leadership. And President Obama is working very closely to try to bring that about. And I think Secretary Kerry's made some progress. Dealing with ISIL is very simple. You got to take them out. These are terrorists. You got to do everything you can. But as King Abdullah of Jordan said, the worst thing we can do is put foreign troops on the ground. That's a recruitment tool for ISIL. So we have to work with representative governments that have the confidence of the Sunni population that they'll be protected by fighting ISIL. We don't have that today. So we have to extend a government that can represent all the people. We've done a better job in Iraq, but we're still not there in Iraq. And then we have the problems of the confidence of the Kurdish populations, which are good fighters, with their central governments. So you have to have a central government that can respond to that. And then lastly, we got to do something about the foreign fighters, because that's threatening our homeland and threatening Europe. So you have to have a much more effective policy of sharing information, and making sure we have good biometrics. Biometrics on documents are something we all should be supporting, because too many people, foreign fighters, are going over to Iraq and Syria, coming back with different documents, and we have to know who these people are in order to protect us against terrorists coming into our homeland. So that's basically a strategy that I think can work. I think I talked to the Russian ambassador yesterday. Even though I'm not allowed to go to Russia because of my position on human rights, they won't give me a visa, I still talk to them. And the Russian ambassador, I thought it was a good conversation about how we should be able to come to a common strategy for getting rid of ISIL. It's in their interest. You know, their plane was shot down. They understand that. So I would hope the international community could come together on a strategy to bring an end to the civil war. You start by ceasefire. You start by having safety for the population and unifying in our campaign against ISIL. Let me again just express how sorry I am I have to leave and go back to Capitol Hill. What you all are doing here is incredibly important, and you really do energize those of us who are fighting the battles on Capitol Hill. As we were discussing here, there's debates going on what's going to happen with the omnibus on the refugees and what's going to happen on the omnibus on a lot of the budget support for the programs we care a great deal about. So I'm going to go back and fight the battle on Capitol Hill, and I know I'm in better shape because I have my army right here fighting these battles. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.